did that for a handful of years, and ultimately I retired federally, and you
Hmm.
know, took a job doing death penalty work as an investigator. So you can kind of see a little bit of a zig there,
Yeah,
right?
I start to see how it's coming together.
Yeah, and so here I am doing death penalty work, which was very difficult for me because we were part of the criminal defense team,
All right.
and I would say, Rose, that that's the point to where I really began to evolve and grow. And I mentioned this to you the other day, but when you're police, we often would have kind of a binary view of the world, right? Things are black and
Hmm.
white. It's this or that. It's right or wrong. And I love the analogy of, picture the Price is Right and the Plinko board game that they have where that little chip comes down. And that's really how I kind of lived my life, and that's how I processed information. And sometimes that little chip that falls down the plinko board would get stuck on a peg, and it does something that nobody would expect. Well, I would consider that kind of the gray in everybody's lives, and I refused to recognize and acknowledge the gray in world. And you can't do criminal defense work without having a better understanding of how did somebody get from birth to being charged with killing 4 people. And we would call that mitigation, to at least develop an understanding of it. And I would always say that, along the way, there's no attempt to try to justify it, but there is always, and it's very important that we understand how somebody got there. And
Right.
then, of course, in a criminal proceeding, that needs to be explained to a jury on how somebody would get there. And of course, they have hard decisions to make thereafter in a capital murder case. So, I had to learn a lot about mitigation. I had to learn about this gray. And I can tell you, Kirk Nowaker really kind of evolved from, perhaps I could say I was a tough guy at one time, and I'm a little bit more kindler and gentler. Still think I'm tough in some ways.
Yeah.
But I feel like, I don't know. I want to take the time to sit back and process what's happening, and not necessarily, default to that Plinko board where I have to do this or I have to do this. Let me think about it and try to develop a better understanding of what's happening. So, anyways, I was there, and then at some point, where I live, a magistrate judge position had become available. There was a justice of the peace who had occupied the magistrate position for county government for several years, and she really became a rock star in the community. And then I got hired, and she became my mentor. And this is Judge Roxanne Nelson. She serves on the commission
Yes, she's on
with
our commission.
JCMH. And you can't be an understudy of Judge Nelson and not develop an appreciation and really kind of a better understanding, at least judicially, on how mental health can impact the criminal justice system. So, I tried to learn as much as I could. I had several people. I remember one time the public defender here, the chief public defender, said something like, when you work with Roxanne, you'd be a fool not to listen and try to be a sponge and take in as much as you could from her. And that had always resonated with me. So, anyways, that kind of opened the door to mental health. And here I find myself in a position to where I did some testimony at the Capitol as a magistrate judge, and I really enjoyed that aspect of the job. And here I am now serving in a public policy role with the ARC of Texas. And it's the IDD field, right? Persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Yes.
And like so many lay people out there, oh, IDD, that's a mental health thing. This is going to be a really easy transition for me because I just kind of lumped it all into one category.
Hmm.
And yet, it didn't take me just a couple hours into my very first day to understand that, IDD is not mental health. I mean, of course, there can be somebody who is IDD who is in need of mental health services, but it's not mental health. So I can tell you, I've been in this position now for just short of a year, and every single day, no joke, Rose, every single day, I am learning something new about the space that I occupy and advocate on behalf of.
I learn something new every day. In my position, I came from a reporting background, and so I was always learning new things. But the intersection of criminal justice, mental health, and then also IDD, substance use disorders, it's quite an interesting field and a very complicated one at that.
Incredibly complicated. I mean, look, I think I would have guessed a year ago that by now, oh my gosh, I'm going to develop such a great expertise in this field, and I hope to get to the point to where perhaps I'm recognized as an expert. And golly, go to Kirk Nowicker, he knows what the heck he's talking about. And Rose, I am far from that. But
Getting there.
hopefully I'm getting there. And the people that occupy the space around me, they are all so darn smart, and they have been
Oh,
in the
yes.
space for so long, and they are truly the experts. And now here I am, a guy who, kind of had an unusual journey to get to this place. And I don't speak like a lot of the people in this community do, right? I mean, because they have the terminology down perfect. I'm still working on the terminology. The acronyms, I'm still trying to figure some of those out. Somebody
Me
can
too.
throw 5 acronyms in one sentence, and I feel like I'm listening to a different language. But I try to use that to my advantage, Rose, because I'm a guy that came from a very, again, I use the word binary background. I mean, that's the way I was raised. That was my career, and now I find myself in this unusual space. So I know a little bit more maybe about it than your average person, but I am certainly not an expert yet. And I kind of feel like I'm floating in this middle zone, almost like a translator. And I try to use that to my advantage. And so far, I think people have been relatively receptive when I've been able to provide testimony at the Capitol, before the Senate, and before the House, and my role at the Judicial Commission as a collaborative council member. What I might perceive as a weakness because I don't have strengths in certain areas, I try to turn that into an asset because I'm kind of bringing a very unique perspective to this field.
Yes, I definitely agree. And a great thing about our commission meetings or any time that our collaborative council and commissioners get together, it's people from all different fields. So we have mental health professionals, we have public health professionals, people in the policy space like yourself, judges, attorneys, people who work at jails. And everyone brings such a unique perspective to things. And everyone has different backgrounds as well. So you come from law enforcement, but now you're in this policy space. So that's such a important perspective to bring. And that's why I just love when everyone gets together. It always teaches me a ton. I learn a lot. And I think it's just so important to have all those voices in one space.
It's really representative of why we're called a collaborative council, right? I mean, because there's just
Exactly.
so many different voices with so many different backgrounds and expertises and experiences that, yeah, you're right. You can't be around this group and not walk away every time you're part of the group with a new or better understanding of a particular subject or a way to think about things or view things. So, yeah, I mean, I think in Texas, I mean, look, we have a long way to go nationally. And I probably can say that here in Texas, we still have a long way to go. But I'm so darn proud of some of the efforts that and achievements that the state of Texas has gotten to, the creation of the Judicial Commission on Mental Health.
Right.
Lawmakers, I think year after year, are developing a better understanding of mental health, or the field that I represent, IDD. And, they're more receptive to talking points that we have. Everybody's got a one pager, and when we hammer the talking points on our one pager, I think people are listening more and more every year. And as long as that trajectory is going in the right direction, that's a good thing. I'm sure so many of us would like to see it go a little bit faster, but we are at least heading in the right direction. And I can say that as a now proud Texan, former Yankee. I think Texas is, when we open our eyes and we have a better understanding of things, well, Texas is slowly opening its eyes to the importance of mental health and IDD matters,
Yes.
especially in what you're doing and what I'm doing, but especially in the criminal justice field. My area of focus with the Arc of Texas is mental health and criminal justice matters, and there are many things happening in the criminal justice field that involve mental health and IDD persons that needs to be addressed.
And we're just 5 years old. So, to your point of people are really coming around to this field and how important mental health and IDD rights are. So, we're relatively innovative. Not all states, not nearly all states, are doing what Texas is doing. So, I think it's really great. Like you said, there's always room for improvement, but I think we're on a good track.
I agree. You said IDD rights, and that brings certain buzzwords to my mind when we talk about equity and equality and this and that, and regrettably sometimes when we watch the media, these words have been hijacked by fringe groups and trying to use them to score a political point. But I can tell you just at the grassroots component of when we talk about equity and inequality, that's certainly applicable to somebody who's in a mental health crisis and now they find themselves in the criminal justice system. Or in my field, again, with somebody who's being in processed at a jail who has an intellectual and developmental disability, a history of that. How do we adjust the system to best be a resource to this defendant to one, have a better understanding of the system that they're in, right? I mean, and that can be something as simple as an advisement of rights, like a magistrate would do. That could be something as simple as responding to a 1622 order that a magistrate orders to the local mental health authority who sends in a representative. But we all need to have a better understanding of what this process looks like and how can we change to better communicate with that person, because the last thing anybody wants, and I can tell you, even judges and law enforcement with the background that I have, right, that binary view of the world, I think so many more people now understand that we don't want, jails are not the best place or a repository for people who are in a mental health crisis, right? I mean, if there's a way that we can facilitate services to that defendant, ideally it's not through a jail system, because regrettably what happens is that their lives begin to deteriorate and they often don't necessarily understand the situation that they're in, the environment that they find themselves in. They can be victimized from other people in the jail. They can find themselves in a position to where jail may not have a really good understanding the best way to communicate with an IDD individual or somebody who's in a mental health crisis. And now it's perceived as a behavioral problem. And we know that jailers, and rightfully so, right? Because there are people that do bad things in jails, and we want our jailers and we want the system to be as safe as possible. But all the while, we need to be as strategic as we can in identifying people who might be in a mental health crisis, who might have a history of being IDD, which includes their cognitive ability to understand instructions from a jailer or a person of authority, a roadside law enforcement officer. And these are things that I can tell you, me and the ARC of Texas and so many other advocacy organizations out there are really focused on. And I would be remiss if I didn't say JCMH. The Judicial Commission has really put a lot of focus into IDD matters and how can we improve the system, beginning from before a person even has contact with a law enforcement officer, right? When we look at that Sims model, and I suspect some people that are listening to this are familiar with the Sims model, but that sequential intercept map that talks about grassroots community level services for somebody, but in the event that they have contact with law enforcement and now in a subsequent adjudication process, what does that look like and what resources are available to not only the figure of authority, which could be government, could be county, it could be the state, it could be prosecution, it could be criminal defense, it could be a public defender, but also it's important that we provide services to the defendant. And I can tell you that was something that I was always hyper focused on. As look, there's a statutory requirement from what needs to happen at a magistration hearing, but also, there is a really enormous benefit to the adjudication process that's about to begin in trying to stabilize this defendant. So, if that means that I bring in a local mental health authority or a local LIDA, or if I have to bring in some type of substance abuse services while somebody's either in jail or out of jail could be addressed by terms and conditions of bond that a magistrate can impose at the time of magistration. But the quicker that we can kind of stabilize that defendant, well, generally speaking, the better that defendant is and more reliable that defendant is in the process. And streamlining an adjudication system is always an objective and goal for government.
this kind of all goes back to your point of gray area, and it's not just black and white. In the criminal justice system, I feel like historically it's been so black and white, but now seeing this area of, okay, maybe everything's not so simple, especially when it comes to Texans who have IDD or mental health condition.
Yeah. Look, and obviously, Rose, but there's a staff attorney there, and her name is Kema Harris. And
Yes.
Kema and I have worked together for many years. In fact, when I got started doing capital defense work, Kema was already employed by that organization. And essentially, Kema and I were partnered up. She worked mitigation, I worked fact investigations. So here's your fact investigator with a very definitive, concrete view of the world. And now here's this mitigation specialist who literally has a very open mind to everything, like, well, why don't
Yeah.
we consider this or this? And there would be times that Kama would drive me nuts. And I know that I've driven her nuts several times as we've traveled around the country together working on death penalty cases. But I learned so much from Kama. And again, we talk about that gray, but I mean, I understand the importance, if not for the touchy-feely component, there is an importance in understanding how somebody ended up in the position that they're in, for a multitude of reasons. But one, we can, the more we know about them, the better and more effective that we can communicate with them, right? Or the more that we know about them, then we might be able to develop theories based on a pattern of behavior. So it's all very important, even to the guy who's got a very hard view of the world, to the person that tends to be a little bit more understanding of these things. And I can tell you my needle has certainly moved one way.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially in my current role and even just in my life in general, is the world is such a better place when people make an effort to understand where other people are coming from.
I know. Rose, if you told me that 20 years ago, I would have chalked you up to being a hippie. And I mean, look, we say keep Austin weird, and I would have kind of categorized you and filed you away as somebody that really has a kind of an interesting, bizarre take on the world. And as the years have gone by, and as I have occupied the space longer and longer, I'm kind of turning into somebody like that, right? I'm that person that I would say
Mhm.
is a hippie. Because it is, Rose. I mean, there's no arguing about it. There's really no debate about it. Once you kind of buy into the mindset and the notion that we need to understand each other a little bit better, and certainly need to be more tolerant of another person's views. It doesn't mean that everything Rose tells me I'm going to have to buy into. No, I sure that there's going to be some things that I
Right.
don't agree with. But there's a value in
That
I would say there's a
conversation,
value
that
in knowing
debate.
why you feel that way, and you know what? There might be some things that I can learn from it, and perhaps as long as we have a respectful exchange about it, maybe there's something that you pick up from me, and I use you and
Exactly.
I as an example, but certainly as Kayma and I have spent hours and hours and hours and hours on road trips working death penalty cases all over the place. I mean, we were forced to have hard conversations about things and really kind of address some of these differences, and again, I feel like I'm a better person for it now.
En este crimen de la semana, Crime Stoppers y la policía del Paso buscan identificar a un hombre que amenazó a dos otros con una pistola.
El domingo 19 de mayo a las 10 a.m., dos hombres caminaban hacia el norte por la calle Giles cuando un hombre en una camioneta roja apuntó una pistola hacia ellos. El sospechoso fue capturado en video entrar a la tienda DK en el 800 Norte Carolina. El hombre es hispano en sus 30s o 40s, de estatura baja, cuerpo delgado y usa bigote y barba de cadena y está quedando calvo. El sospechoso manejaba una camioneta Nissan modelo anterior color roja de 2 puertas y fue visto manejar por la Carolina hacia North Loop. Se alega que el hombre apuntó una pistola negra hacia las víctimas.
Cualquier persona con información sobre la identidad de este hombre debe de llamar anónimamente a Crime Stoppers del Paso al 566-8477, 566-TIPS. In this Crime of the Week, Crime Stoppers in the El Paso Police Department is looking to identify a man that threatened 2 others with a handgun.
On Sunday, May 19th at 10 a.m., two men were walking north on Giles when a man in a red pickup truck pointed a gun at them. The suspect was captured on video going into the DK store at 800 North Carolina. The man is Hispanic, in his late 30s or 40s, short, has a small build, a mustache and goatee, and is balding on top. The suspect was in a red two-door older model Nissan pickup truck and was last seen driving on Carolina towards North Loop. The man is alleged to have pointed a black handgun towards the victims.
Anyone with any information on the identity of this man should call Crime Stoppers of El Paso at 566-8477. That's 566-TIPS.
The insanity defense in Texas is when there's a claim that you are not in your mental capacity at the time of the commission of the crime. There's competency issues, which deals with your mental state at the time of trial and your communication with your representation or your counsel. Insanity deals with your, what they call mens rea, your mental state at the time of the commission of the crime.
Thank you for holding. This is Karina. How can I help you?
Hi, Karina. My name is Andre. I hope you're not busy. I just had a couple questions about the robbery that happened last summer. There was a theft of a firearm.
Yes, sir. Well, yes, I have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, one of your employees, she said that you were there that day.
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. You mind giving me like a description of what the event was like? I mean, was there like, I'm guessing that this man, like, he didn't think someone was looking, and maybe he put his hand behind the glass to take the gun, or how did it happen?
Okay, so this was, I want to say maybe like around 10 in the morning. It was me and one of my employees. We were really slow. He was probably our first customer, so he walked in. He was wearing a hoodie. He was all black. He was wearing a mask. So he walks straight to our gun case. So he's just looking at the guns, right? So then he started asking us, what's the process of getting a gun? So then I tell him, I'm like, well, you need an ID with everything valid on it, and even for you to see it. And he's like, oh, okay. So he's like, can I see one? So then as I'm coming around, I ask him, well, can I see your ID? And he starts just patting his pockets around, and then he's just like, oh, I forgot it. And then I'm like, oh, so unfortunately, then I cannot show you a gun without an ID. And then he's like, oh, okay. So then he just still stood there. So I stood there for a little, and then I was like, well, if you have any other questions, let me know. So I walked around, and then he's just still there in the case, kind of just pacing around them, just looking at the gun case. So, I'm just looking at him, I don't know, something's just telling me, like, just keep an eye. So I'm like, okay. So at this point, I'm like, you know what? Oh, he's not going to do anything. So at that moment, I turn around to grab something from the counter, and I turn back around, and I just see him come out with I guess he had like a hammer on his hoodie, like in the pocket hoodie. And I just saw the hammer come up, and then I was like, no, and he just he hit the glass with the hammer. And then he just stuck his hand in, and he just grabbed the gun and ran. So, I mean, everything just happened so quick. Like I said, when I turned back, he was already hitting the glass with something, and it broke quick. I guess he hit it really hard, so it broke quick, and he just put his hand in there, he grabbed it, and, my employee was, like, on that side of the counter, so he tried to run after him, so I was like, hey, no, I'm like, just let him go. So he ran, so from there, we just let him run. So that's pretty much what happened there.
20-year-old Horizon City man is now behind bars after he allegedly stole a gun from a pawn shop. And according to Horizon City Police Department, officers responded to a panic alarm from the Benny's Pawn Shop on Horizon Boulevard. Investigators discovered Jesse KLINGMAN had stolen a handgun from the glass case and then fled the scene. Witnesses reportedly saw the suspect running toward a Walmart. Officers searched the area and eventually arrested KLINGMAN.